Well, good morning, colleagues, and welcome back to the final session of our African Union Smart Safety Surveillance Capacity Strengthening Training. We've been going since December. I think I counted we've covered 16 or 17 of these sessions, starting with data collection and moving through the pharmacovigilance process. And here we are. Session 2, Module 5 on Pharmacovigilance Expert Advisory Committees. This session follows on from last week, where Claire Davis took us through the role of national pharmacovigilance committees, and today we're joined by Patrick Batty, who is our expert scientific assessor at the MHRA and has been up until very recently the MHRA's delegate on the PRAC, which is a joint committee for Europe. So Patrick's going to follow on from where Claire left us last week, moving from national to joint committees. Just have the next slide, please, Tyra. So, as usual, we're joined by colleagues across the African Union. As always, I would stress and remind you that these sessions, this one is being recorded, and for those colleagues that cannot make it, please encourage them to watch the recordings when they are made available. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we've been going since the turn of the year. So we've taken the journey through this capacity strengthening program, from data collection to signal detection and benefit risk assessments, through to safety communications, and now we finish on the role of the expert advisory committees. So I think you were given the aims of the sessions last week, but just to recap, is to understand how a committee could be established, the composition, roles and responsibilities of a committee. From an assessor's point of view, how to prepare documentation for committees to make their recommendations. And today we'll be focusing, as I said, on understanding how joint committees and inter-country reviews about safety work in practice, and then how those considerations move into decision making at a national level. As always, we're using Zoom, and we have the Q&A box for the submitting of questions to either myself or Patrick. Please use the Q&A box rather than the chat function or the raising of hands. We monitor the Q&A box for picking up any questions that you might have. So without further ado, Patrick, I'll hand over to you, and then we will hopefully pick up, we'll have time for a bit of a Q&A at the end where we can pick up any questions from colleagues. Thanks, Patrick, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mick. It's a very great pleasure to be online with you all this morning and to give this presentation as part of Module 5. As Mick has said, my name's Patrick Batty. I've worked at the MHRA for a little over 12 years now in a few different roles in pharmacovigilance, including working with our national ADR reporting scheme, the Yellow Card scheme, working in signal detection and assessment, as well as benefit risk assessment and risk management. And from March 2017 to January 2020, I was the UK's alternate member at the European Joint Safety Committee, the PRAC. And since then, I've also worked with international partners as part of the MHRA's involvement with COVID-19 vaccine work at the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities. Next slide, please. So a quick overview of the presentation for today. I'll quickly go through the aims of the session, and then the bulk of the presentation goes on the next 3 bullet points. So give an example of a joint safety committee in a specific European context, talking about what it's like to be working in a national agency as part of a joint safety committee environment, and some of the the impacts that has and the way that affects national agencies' work. And finally, talking at a bit more of a general level about the structure and function of joint safety committees generally, and some considerations about how the function might affect the form and operation of a joint safety committee. I'll cover pre-submitted questions, summarize quickly at the end, and then, as Mick said, we'll have a chance to take any questions that have come in live during the session. So there's the Q&A function available for that. I'd really encourage you to make use of it. I'm very happy to take those at the end. Next slide, please. So we've seen already the module 5 aims. So just picking out in particular the one there about understanding joint committees and inter-country reviews, a joint safety advisory committee. If we could go to the next slide. So let's just unpack that that statement a little bit more. So I'm going to cover this point by sharing a national agency's experience of a joint safety committee, both by giving some background on the PRAC and how it functions, and as I've said, some thoughts of what it's like for the national agency to be working in that context. I should say that this is, of course, necessarily drawing on a specific set of experience from a specific setting from the PRAC and the MHRA, but I'll be trying to sort of touch on and note some general themes that I think will probably quite widely applicable to this situation of a national agency working in an international setting with a joint safety committee. And as I've said, also reflect more generally on structure and function of joint safety committees. We'll cover the questions as well. And I think it's worth saying a couple of things about what I'm not really intending to cover in the presentation. So I'm not intending to cover processes of the PRAC or joint safety committees in a very fine level of detail to exhaustively cover exactly how every part of a process works for the PRAC would make this presentation several times longer and even drier if such a thing was possible. So I'm aiming to explain the important points of process and structure. But of course, if something's not clear or you'd like more detail on something in particular, please do put it in the Q&A. And I'm also not intending this to be in any way a presentation that says exactly what a joint committee should be like, or to provide a sort of a rigid set of instructions to follow in assembling a joint committee. Because I think, as you'll hear me say again and again, I think a lot of this would be quite context dependent, and that the structure of a joint committee should reflect that and reflect the setting and the the intended function of the committee. So next slide, please. We'll start off then. I'll move to the first section of the presentation proper, which is just to give some background on a joint safety committee in the European setting. So colleagues will be familiar with the PRAC, that's the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee, which is the European Medicines Agency's safety committee. But I didn't want to make too many assumptions about how much of the process people would have been familiar with. So I'm trying to explain some of that and give some insight into functioning here. So the PRAC was formally established by the EU pharmacovigilance legislation in 2012, and its remit is human medicines, which for the purposes of the PRAC includes vaccines, biological medicines, biosimilars, and advanced therapeutic medicinal products as well. So things like gene therapies for cancer, but it doesn't include other things like medical devices, say, or blood transfusion. The PRAC's responsible for all aspects of pharmacovigilance, including safety signal detection and assessment, risk management planning, and the design and conduct of safety studies, communications, and auditing of PV functions. And it was based in London from 2012 to 2019, when the EMA offices were located at Canary Wharf in London. and it's been based in Amsterdam from 2019 onwards. And the UK was, of course, a member of the PRAC from 2012 to January 2020. So I must emphasise, that while I have experience of being one of the UK representatives at the PRAC, I'm not in that capacity anymore, and I'm certainly not saying anything today that's, an official perspective on behalf of the PRAC. Although, of course, the BMHRA maintains very active links with EMA and other regulators in Europe. But so what I'm saying comes very much from my point of view of an MHRA perspective and previous experiences from the Joint Safety Committee working. Next slide, please. So it's quite difficult to get pictures into a presentation about regulatory processes usually, but I had a little go just to give people a bit of a break from text on a background. This is a picture from one of the meeting rooms at the old Canary Wharf offices of the EMA. So it's a meeting room much like this that PRAC meetings would have taken place in. We're seeing a photo here taken from the seats at the end of the room where the chair and EMA staff who are supporting the meeting would sit, and then with PRAC members sitting on the long desks in the middle. Next slide, please. Okay, so the makeup of the PRAC, I've touched on its remit, but who's actually there? Who's actually making up this Joint Safety Committee? So there's a chair who's elected by the members from among the PRAC members, and then there's one member and one alternate member from each EU member state, and also from Norway and Iceland, who are not EU member states but are involved in the PRAC. There are also 6 independent scientific experts, and they're appointed by the European Commission to just bolster and support and enhance the scientific expertise available to the PRAC for its discussions. And they'd typically, be selected because their areas of expertise are particularly relevant for pharmacovigilance. So there would typically be at least one of those experts would be an expert in pharmacoepidemiology. Other areas include things like the safety of medicines in pregnancy, where there's been an expert with that background appointed to the PRAC. And the European Commission also appoints one member and one alternate to represent patients from the EU, and one member and one alternate representing healthcare professionals from the EU. So that's the membership that makes up the PRAC, and takes part in all its discussions. The PRAC meets every month for a 4-day meeting, typically from midday on a Monday to sometime on a Thursday afternoon. And in normal times, it would hold 11 of those meetings in person, and one in the summer would be done in writing only to accommodate a bit of a summer break. Obviously, in current circumstances with the pandemic, the PRAC has been meeting by teleconference. And the EMA publishes agendas, minutes, and highlights from PRAC meetings on its websites. You've very possibly seen those already, but if not, there's a link there. And I think those can give a very useful indication of the amount and type of business that PRAC's covering each month, as well as being very useful to see from the highlights some of the recommendations that are coming out of PRAC meetings. Next slide, please. So just another chance to get a picture in. These are the 2 chairs that the PRAC has had so far. On the left, that's Dr. June Rain, now CEO of the MHRA, who was chair of the PRAC from its first meeting in July 2012 up till August 2018. And on the right, Dr. Sabine Strauss from the national regulator in the Netherlands, who took over the role of the PRAC chair from September 2018 onwards. So the chair is elected for a 3-month term, which can be renewed once, so for a total maximum of 6 years. So it was 2018, it was time for the PRAC to elect a new chair. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of just the last background slide, support for the running of the pracs provided by the EMA. So it's the EMA staff make up the prac secretariat and make sure the meetings happen. I'll say a little bit more about the structure of a prac meeting in a moment, but in terms of all those organizational kind of roles and support, that's provided by the EMA. The prac's working within a sort of a formal framework for its reviews of safety and its discussions of safety topics. So there are formal processes for all these kinds of reviews of medicine safety, and they have their basis in EU law that's common to the member countries. And what the prac's doing in that context is providing legally binding recommendations about medicine safety. So the prac may recommend things like information to go into the product information for medicines, or risk minimization measures to implement across the EU, and that's legally binding. And it may also be providing its advice to other EMA committees. So, for example, the EMA's licensing committee, at the time of licensing a new medicine, the prac will be giving advice on what's appropriate in terms of risk minimization and possibly any other safety studies that might need to be done in the years immediately following authorization. For example, to get data on the safety profile of a medicine in a real world setting, to support the information that's available from a clinical trial population. And the prac's doing all this by having scientific discussions among its members, so the representatives from all the countries, plus the experts, the patients and healthcare professional representatives. And the prac may also hear advice from other sources, so the EMA can set up specific expert groups to advise on particular issues. So if there's a very large, complicated, important safety issue, it may be the case that the prac feels it would benefit from specific scientific advice from experts in the field, especially if it's a very complicated or very specialized area of science or medicine. And in that case, a group can be set up that would meet outside the regular monthly meetings made up of experts. These are not members of the prac, these are other experts from the EU. The prac would ask questions, specific scientific questions of that group, and consider the answers as part of its discussions, but it would remain for the prac to be answering questions about regulatory action. What's the position on benefit risk balance or appropriate regulatory actions to take for a medicine. And the prac may also hear from other sources as well. For example, oral explanations from pharmaceutical companies who might be invited by the prac to present their data and their analysis and their view of an issue, or they might request to do so for a procedure involving one of their products. And there's also scope to have public hearings in the context of large safety reviews, the procedures that in the prac terminology are called safety referrals. And these will allow for members of the public, practicing healthcare professionals, to attend a prac session and give their experience, their perspective and input. And so far, 2 of those have happened. One was for the issue of the safety of valproate-containing medicines in pregnancy, and the other for a review of serious and long-lasting side effects with fluoroquinolone antibiotics. So those were both very high-profile and important, safety concerns where an oral public hearing has taken place. There's recordings on the EMA website as well as information about those. So they're not common. That's 2 over the sort of the 9-year history of the prac, but they are very, very important. And just lastly, to say that the prac is a voting committee. Typically, in the vast majority of cases, a prac recommendation and a prac view is reached by consensus and agreement among all the members. But the ultimate decision-making mechanism that underpins this is voting, and that's available in case there's a split of opinion, especially if it's a very closely balanced split in terms of the views among members. and a vote would usually be taken as a matter of course for a high profile issue like the safety referral type issues that I've talked about, just to provide a record, even if it turned out to be unanimous. Voting's taken on high profile important issues as a matter of course. And if there are members who hold a different view from the one that gets taken forward as the PRAC recommendation, there's scope for them to record a divergent position. So there's a record of the reasons for anyone who didn't vote in support of the eventual recommendation. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've gone through the the remit, the composition of the PRAC, and so on. Just to have one last slide in this section, just to talk a bit more about the practicalities of how a meeting actually goes ahead. So there's a meeting every month, and as I've said, it's the EMA who are providing the secretariat that support this. There'll be an agenda prepared and circulated by the EMA staff. There's formal timetables determining, for each procedure, each item, what dates the documents need to be circulated on in advance of the meeting, and which monthly meeting it will end up coming back to. So, for example, for a regular safety review for a medicine, what would be called a periodic safety update report in the PRAC terminology, there'll be a set of dates listed that says when the company needs to submit the data for review, when the leading national competent authority from among the PRAC members reviews that data and sends a written assessment to the PRAC, and which monthly meeting it comes back to for discussion and recommendation. As I've just mentioned, the documents that the PRAC's discussing, there'll be a document for each item in the form of an assessment report. Those are prepared by the staff at the national regulatory agencies. For each medicine, a particular agency will be acting as a rapporteur, which just means that they essentially lead on producing the assessment content for that medicine. So, for example, when the UK was a PRAC member, one of the medicines the UK was rapporteur for was etanercept. So every year or so, or couple of years, when a regular scheduled periodic safety update report was due, it was the UK that would review those data and write the assessment report and circulate it. Or if for any reason a signal was raised for etanercept outside of that cycle through spontaneous reports or published literature or any other source, again, the UK would produce that assessment report and circulate it. And the other members who aren't rapporteur for the medicine, their responsibility is to review that report and provide written comments ahead of the meeting. And the rapporteur may also provide a set of slides to support the discussion ahead of the meeting. So all that's going on in the run-up to the meeting. One last thing I'll say as well is about the concept of silent adoption versus plenary discussion. So not every item will necessarily get live discussion at the actual PRAC meeting with a presentation by the rapporteur and discussion among the members. It may be possible that for some items, the written documents ahead of the meeting alone are sufficient for the PRAC to be able to make a recommendation at its meeting without actually having a live discussion. That's reserved for straightforward, non-controversial issues. So, for example, a regular scheduled safety update review for a very well-established medicine that's got a very very good benefit risk profile and for which the risks are well understood, have been on the market for decades. If that kind of procedure is being done, the rapporteur's reviewed all the evidence. They've concluded in their report that there's no new significant safety information, and that the current regulatory position is okay, and there's no action needed. They've circulated that report. Other members have reviewed it and commented in writing and said, yes, we agree with this assessment. In that situation, it may be unnecessary to have a discussion, so that could be flagged for silent adoption, and it would just be dealt with in writing. in order to make best and most efficient use of the valuable discussion time for the higher priority items. But that's obviously not appropriate for a major issue, or one that's controversial, or where there's new concerning evidence about safety, and those kinds of items would always get plenary discussions. So any new signal procedure or major safety review is always going to get plenary discussion at the PRAC. So all that in the first two bullet points has only really taken us up to the start of a meeting, I guess. We've had the agenda circulated, relevant documents circulated, and comments made available. Decisions will have been made on anything that can be taken silently versus everything else that will need discussion among all the members in the plenary meeting. And so in the actual week of the meeting itself, as I've said, this would run from midday on a Monday usually to sometime on a Thursday afternoon. And during it, what will happen is that the rapporteurs will present all the topics they're leading at the PRAC meeting, present their slides and their proposals for what would be an appropriate recommendation based on their national agency's review. And that's followed by discussion among all members to agree on a recommendation. And that's where additional, and for some items, that'll be possible to just take that as a single discussion, agree on a recommendation, and then, done, and that can be adopted. Additional work may be needed for some, though, for complex issues, and in which case what will typically happen is that the rapporteur and perhaps some other PRAC members in a smaller group will go away and do some more work on this, during a coffee break or something like that, and work towards modifying the original proposal in a way that addresses points raised during the discussion. So that could be redrafting proposals that have been made for product information wording, or reviewing and adapting an original proposal that was made about advice to be given to healthcare professionals and patients, and then that might need to come back for a second round of discussion among all the members. So it becomes quite a task to manage the timetabling over a multi-day meeting where this sort of thing's happening, and it's a huge amount of work for the EMA Secretariat, and requires a lot of effort and deft management from them and from the chair as well, because you've got items going away and then coming back later for further discussion. And the EMA also manages any voting if any is needed on any particular items. Next slide, please. Okay, and I'm just to close out this sort of overview of the PRAC's structure and processes and all these specific examples. This is a picture from the EMA's new office buildings in Amsterdam. We're looking up in an atrium. There's a sort of vertical garden, green wall type of arrangement in there, which looks quite nice. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll move on to the next section then of the presentation, which is just some thoughts and reflections about what it's like, specifically from the point of view of the national agencies who are working in the context of a joint safety committee and contributing to this work, and what impact that has on their assessments, regulatory activities. So the first thing I wanted to reflect on was the impact this has on workload and resources. Obviously, it means there's a need for assessment resources from staff and their time to prepare assessment documents. So, in this specific example, that's preparing assessment reports to be circulated to PRAC members for discussion. But that process could include other work as well. So it's very possible that for an important issue, that might mean there's a need for assessment work to go into getting a paper to take to advice from a national committee first before it's due for an assessment report to the PRAC. So that's something that the MHRA will have done many times, going to either the Pharmacovigilance Expert Advisory Group or the Commission on Human Medicines that we heard about in session 1. Going to them for national advice on the MHRA's assessment and view of a particular issue, and then incorporating that advice into the assessment that goes round to the prac. So it can be quite quite a resource requiring process. And there's also the need to have assessors' time and resources to review assessment reports that are being circulated by the other prac members from other national agencies in their capacities as rapporteurs for particular medicines, in order to review those, provide written comments on whether or not those are agreeing or highlighting particular issues, or suggesting an alternative approach or an alternative view of the data and what's an appropriate recommendation. And there's of course a need for some specific staff time to provide a prac member and an alternate to attend the meetings. Alternate in brackets there, that's kind of in the prac context, that's quite dependent on the size of the agency really. A larger agency that was rapporteur for quite a large number of medicines would typically send both a member and an alternate to every meeting, because they would be leading on so many presentations. It would would have swamped a single member only, whereas some of the smaller regulators, perhaps not with as many rapporteurships and not making as many presentations, might send a member only, usually perhaps only sending an alternate when the member wasn't available, or under certain circumstances when there was particular issues being discussed. So yeah, there's a requirement for resource for experienced members of staff to carry out that work, and for the prac that meant the best part of a week's worth of meeting every month, and then time in between spent liaising with colleagues, looking at assessments that are going to be going to the next meeting, feeding back from the previous prac meeting. So it took up pretty much a full-time job for two people. So it can have quite an impact on resource working as part of a joint international safety committee. Next slide, please. There's also some particular ways of working that get emphasised when a national agency is part of a joint committee, particularly for the members or the members of staff who are regularly attending. And I think the ones I'd particularly highlight, a real emphasis on clear communication, especially in a sort of a short frame of time when presenting at a joint safety meeting and having some discussions. And that's in contrast to perhaps when working within one's own national agency. There's usually a little bit more time available for discussions over the course of a few days to sort of tease out an issue, get understanding, clear up any points where things aren't clear. That's not really the case when you've got a 4-day meeting. It sounds like quite a long time, 4 days, but when you take into account all the many items being covered, usually that means quite a short period of time to sort of make your case for your assessment that you've made as a rapporteur, or to put across your comments on someone else's assessment, especially if you're suggesting a different approach. There's not a lot of time to keep coming back to it, or to gradually build on those discussions over days or anything. So it's really important to be able to communicate clearly with the other members of the committee. Equally important, rapid liaison with the staff back at the national agency. Things can move very quickly if there's a presentation at the joint committee, and there's differing views on the best way forward there, and that can include raising new proposals for an action that perhaps haven't been considered in the original written assessment, and in that situation it'll be really important to get views from the colleagues at the national agency, especially those with relevant expertise and who've perhaps been involved in reviewing assessment reports. So quick communication on the timescale of hours, possibly minutes, really comes into play there. And finally, I think I'd just say it's a bit of a different context when you're part of a joint safety committee with multiple national agencies represented, especially when there can be differences in their national experience and healthcare systems and use of medicines. That can lead to some differing views on what's an appropriate action in response to safety information for a medicine. So even within the EU, you can have a situation where a medicine has different indications in different countries, and might have a use in one country that it doesn't exist elsewhere. And that can lead to some differing views about what's the possible impact of regulatory action, what's the best way of balancing benefits and risks. And so in those cases, it's really important when working collaboratively in an international setting, to be able to tap into a bit of pragmatism and recognize the situations where a compromise can be made, or a national position could be modified to reach something that can work best for everyone. I mean, that being said, at the same time, while it's not necessarily tenable to insist 100% on getting your national agency's preferred outcome every single time on every issue, and you've got to be skilled at identifying middle ground and compromising. That being said, it's equally important to know when you really have to dig your heels in and argue strongly for a particular course of action based on your agency's assessment, based on the need to protect public health, but where perhaps not everyone's immediately convinced by the arguments there. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the last slide I've got on sort of what it's like for a national agency working in a joint safety committee setting. I just wanted to sort of touch on a few challenges as well as benefits, and this is not necessarily intended to be a completely exhaustive list, but just to highlight what I think are some key points. So for challenges, I mean, one here clearly is potentially about timelines. Do the joint safety committee timelines fit with national expert committee timelines? Now, obviously, in setting up a national safety committee, that potentially would be a consideration, and a lot of national agencies will have had the opportunity to deliberately fit timelines for national expert groups in order to match well with those of a joint safety committee. So lots of members of the PRAC will have a national safety committee that meets a little in advance of the PRAC schedule. So there's the opportunity to conduct the regulator's assessment, get national advice, and then take that position forward into the joint discussions. But that's not guaranteed to be the case always or in all circumstances, and that can make things more challenging for the agency, for the assessment team to try and get the national expert advice that they need in a way that still lets them deliver it to a joint committee discussion at the optimal time. A big potential challenge as well is what about positions coming out of a joint safety committee that aren't necessarily fully aligned with what the view nationally was from the national regulator or national experts. And that, of course, will depend on the nature of the joint committee, whether it's making sort of legally binding recommendations, or if those are more in the vein of being guidance, or being provided to give an overview of science and give information, and that can be a very challenging one to deal with. Luckily, my experience, it wasn't something that came up very much. And in terms of challenges, just lastly to say resource requirements, I think you're probably getting the sense now that it's quite intensive on the time of staff and assessors at a European agency to be involved in supporting the prac work, and that impression would be right, I would say. So I think definitely it does have an impact on the national agency in terms of the resources that need to be committed to it. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to dwell solely on the challenges. There are clearly benefits to working in this way in a joint safety committee that you know, involves multiple national agencies. So I mean, firstly, there can be also, as well as a challenge on resource, a benefit from, in resource terms, from being involved in a network like this. And that might seem a bit paradoxical. I'm saying it's a challenge and it requires a lot of resource, but it, you know, it provides a benefit in terms of resource. But you know, I think it clearly does in a situation like for the prac, where, you know, rapporteurs from a particular national agency are leading on an assessment. You know, for every procedure like that, where your agency has to lead and write the document and circulate it, there'll be plenty of others where it's another agency who, you know, does the most labor-intensive part of producing, you know, a long, detailed written document and circulates it for comments. And so, you know, the assessment team in your agency in that situation is, you know, reviewing, providing written comments, but they don't have to spend all the time, you know, producing that document themselves. And, you know, the sort of the balance between the resource it requires and the resource it saves, because there's shared working, would, I guess, potentially be different for different agencies depending on their size, the amount of resource they have to begin with, and, you know, how much work they ended up taking on as rapporteurs. But there's definitely a potential benefit there as well, you know, as well as a challenge. But quite apart from the resource issue, I think one of the perhaps more important is Joint Safety Committee working in the way it can facilitate, you know, access to information, experience, and scientific expertise, you know, from outside a national agency or even its national advisory committees, and that, you know, that has a real potential to, you know, to help make sure that regulatory decisions at a national level are informed by, you know, a broad and deep, you know, scientific expertise, and you know, and taking part in the discussions at a joint committee can really strengthen the scientific basis behind you know, a national position. That's both from, you know, hearing people who, you know, agree with and confirm your national assessment, you know, and perhaps are able to add to it. You know, many times I've seen that happen. You know, an assessment report circulated to the prac, and the comments will include people agreeing with its position, and giving their reasons for agreeing, and in doing so, they've sort of gone beyond that and highlighted some additional lines of evidence that sort of further strengthen, you know, that position. But it can also, you know, happen when people don't fully agree, and there can be a kind of, you know, peer review and pressure testing of the arguments and the strength of the data that are being put forward as the basis for a recommendation there. So I think that's a real key, you know, benefit and strength of this as a way of working. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I've covered the first sort of two strands, really, talking about the specific example of the prac, and then the experience of a national regulator working as part of a joint safety committee. These next few slides, just taking a bit of a step back and reflecting generally on the function and structure of joint safety committees. And I said before that, you know, I'm certainly not intending in this presentation to say that every joint safety committee works like the prac or should work like the prac, or there's only one way that a joint safety committee can be put together. I think that's clearly not the case. And I think the most important thing, I think, is that the form of a joint safety committee should follow its function and, you know, be based on what its, you know, exact role and remit is. And there's so many things, I think, that would feed into that. Again, this isn't necessarily exhaustive, but some key ones I was thinking about would be, you know, the constitution of a joint safety committee in terms of member countries or agencies, you know, and the area it's meant to be covering. What's the the legal and regulatory framework looks like. I said for the PRAC, that's the sort of shared among member states. But if you had a joint safety committee covering places that had different legal basis for their regulation, that might have an impact on what recommendations the committee is able to make. The PRAC can make quite detailed recommendations about this is the exact wording that needs to go into the product information for this medicine everywhere in the EU, because the legislation and the regulatory framework is shared and supports that. But if that wasn't the case, that perhaps wouldn't be possible in exactly the same way, and the recommendation might have to be a broader one, giving a view on the science and the balance of benefits and risks. So yeah, I mean, that covers the third point, I think, when I'm talking about what's the output from this joint safety committee, binding decisions or more guidance. It would of course depend as well on the remit in terms of the type of products that are being covered. I outlined the human medicines focus of the PRAC, but that wouldn't necessarily be a universal one, I suppose, for every joint safety committee. Or even something as fundamental as its role, whether it's intended, primarily to share information among members, or to act as a forum for scientific decision making, as the PRAC does. And I put signal detection versus signal assessment in there as well. I mean, as I said, from the example of the PRAC is responsible for both of those things. But the way that works is that for signal detection, it's the national agencies that make up the membership and the EMA as well that carry out signal detection. And once signals detected, the discussions about it will take place at the PRAC. It's not the case that there would ever be a PRAC discussion that looked at a case series of reports or something to decide whether or not there was a signal. But that's not necessarily the only way of doing things, and one might imagine a joint safety committee that did take that approach and took signal detection as part of the discussions, in which case that might have an impact on its form and structure. So lastly, the exact nature of the type of procedures being considered, whether it includes a pretty broad scope of pretty much everything: routine reviews, signals, risk management planning, pharmacovigilance studies, or whether it's got a more restricted focus on signal detection only. That would affect things, and that would have an effect on the amount of work and business for the committee, and that's got a huge impact on structure and function. I mean, I've said already just how much effort it takes, for secretariat support for PRAC meetings when these are, 4-day meetings every month. Next slide, please. I'll go through this quite quickly, I think, but yeah, I mean, various aspects of the form of a joint safety committee that I think would be affected by its function. The membership in terms of where it's drawn from and how many people. How a chair is appointed and for how long, the source of the secretariat, and supporting functions, whether there are independent expert members in addition to members of national regulators, and the frequency and length of the meetings as well, are all things that I think would stem from and flow from the intended function of the committee. And there are perhaps other considerations that maybe don't fit neatly into just form or function. I'm thinking here about possible differences in healthcare systems and settings between members in terms of what the main ways of delivering healthcare and the main healthcare challenges are between the members. That might have an impact. Obviously, for the PRAC and the EU, there's quite some similarities between EU member states, but even there can be differences that are important enough to be felt during the discussions. I've given the example of a medicine with different indications in different parts of Europe, and how that might lead to quite different approaches and proposals for regulatory action from different members. And another one, just something as as simple as language, working language for the committee and a language for its outputs. For practice was English, but that then did mean that for member states where English isn't one of the languages used in their regulation and their product information, that they had a responsibility for translation of those outputs into national languages. So that's something that would need to be considered generally for a joint safety committee that's working at an international level in that kind of way. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've gone through the sort of the three strands of the presentation that I've mentioned. The specific example of the PRAC, the national agency working, and general thoughts on what affects structure and function of committees. I'll quickly cover. We had a question submitted in advance in writing, so thanks very much for that. I've paraphrased it on this slide. This isn't exactly the form of words used, but I think it captures the gist of the question, which was about what's normal for other countries in terms of sources of funding and committee members' time. I think firstly, just to say that I expect that this would, of course, potentially be quite context specific, and I can only really speak exactly to the European setting on this. But certainly for the European setting, as I've said a couple of times, the support functions for the PRAC are carried out by EMA staff, and so it's the EMA budget, funding, and resources that contribute to that. In terms of committee members' time, this is obviously quite a lot for the PRAC, with 4 days per month, following from the function of the PRAC and the amount of business it covers. The members there will be attending as part of their jobs with national agencies. So the resource and funding for their time was coming from national agencies, although the EMA was supporting travel expenses and accommodation when going to meetings in person and having to travel for that. Next slide, please. So we're just about getting to the end. So yeah, a very, very quick summary of what we've covered. So an overview of how a joint safety committee works in a specific EU setting of the PRAC, some considerations for what it's like for national agencies to be working as part of a joint safety committee, and some reflections from a sort of more general view on structure and function of joint safety committees. Again, as I've said, I think a real take home here is one, that there's no single only way to imagine a joint safety committee, and two, that its structure and function, its structure and its form would follow, I think, in large part from its function and remit, intended remit. Next slide, please. Okay, well that brings me to the end of the presentation. So thanks so much everyone for your attention, and I've been focused on going through the slides, so I haven't been looking to see if things are flashing up in the Q&A, but hopefully we have some questions. So I'll close now and perhaps hand back over to Mick. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick. You've given colleagues a lot to think about there, I think, as maybe considerations about joint working take place. There was one question that came through the Q&A box, and it's actually for one that I was thinking of asking you myself, because it strikes me that there's a formal and an informal relationship that is fostered between colleagues on a joint committee. And Yvonne has asked, when you refer to benefiting from a network of agencies, I guess you mean the national regulatory agencies. But I was thinking that, in a committee like the PRAC, where there are a large number of colleagues from across a union, that you form relationships, and obviously there is the formal ways of working, but you must have formed some really useful informal relationships as well, where you can ask questions of experienced colleagues, etc. Can you give us some insights?
Yeah, absolutely. That's dead right. So yeah, the benefits of that kind of collaborative working. Yeah, I am talking about benefits at the level of formal interaction between national agencies, but dead right that it does extend beyond that, and it's a really fertile ground for joint safety committees, a really fertile ground for its members to build connections and relationships that definitely can have benefits outside work that's sort of formally part of the joint committee considerations, and that's we're definitely still benefiting from those kinds of contacts and connections even now that the UK is not formally part of the PRAC. We still use those contacts with other agencies. Absolutely.
Thanks, Patrick. You gave a couple of examples where you described the need for compromise sometimes, where a national position may be reached, and then in the joint committee it doesn't necessarily go the way that the national recommendation had set out. Have you got any examples of, from a UK perspective, where we had to compromise and what the issue was? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's quite all right. I mean, I think what I would say is we're probably quite fortunate, actually. I think in that when I think back over those kinds of situations, I think a lot of them ended with often a position that was fairly close to a UK view. I think I can think of, without necessarily getting into detail and naming specific products or safety concerns, I think I can think of some examples where it might be quite a subtle example, actually, but in terms of things like wording for product information, if a new potential side effect been identified, there's often a question about whether it's sufficient to list it as a potential side effect, or whether whether the recommendation should go a bit beyond that and say something along the lines of what healthcare professionals and patients should look out for in terms of signs and symptoms, possible tests that should be done. And I think I can think of a couple of situations where perhaps we might have taken a different view of the the strength of evidence to support that a particular test might be helpful for picking up early signs and symptoms of this particular condition, or whether it might be really a little bit non-specific perhaps, and on that basis perhaps the UK view had been it's sufficient to inform healthcare professionals of this being a potential side effect, but to be silent on how it might be investigated, and leave that up to national guidance, clinical expertise and their judgment, rather than being too prescriptive and steering them one way or the other. But perhaps there might have been an overall majority among other members who did favour putting something in like that. And that's the kind of situation where perhaps I can think of maybe an occasion or two where we may have compromised by sort of going along with that broad overall view from the majority of other members, but perhaps making some suggestions as to how to word that recommendation, just maybe to soften it, so that while it does mention a particular preferred test, it doesn't say that that's the only way of doing things, and leaves a little bit of wriggle room for it to be interpreted, to allow some other approaches too. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I guess these kind of insights are sometimes very subtle, and I think you know, as an English-speaking country, sometimes the language of the recommendations and the wording for the patient information, when being written up in English, you mentioned the need for translations, but the understanding of the meaning of the way some things are worded can be quite important to be really clear on what the message is. Sometimes, as an English-speaking country, obviously we don't appreciate some of the nuances of our language when interpreted by others.
Yeah, fully agree. Sorry, Mick, I don't know if you wanted me to particularly add
No,
or
just a conversation piece.
Yeah, no, I mean, dead right. I mean, and I've got nothing but admiration to, you know, for my colleagues on the prac who are working in, you know, a second language, but it definitely, you know, could throw up, you know, some sort of tricky points for people who are either having to translate, you know, translate to a national language, or yeah, just to navigate the subtleties of making a, you know, a specific clear recommendation, even just in English, that's not open to some accidental misinterpretation that, you know, would be really you know, really disadvantageous and to be avoided.
Thank you, Patrick. So we've reached our time and have no other questions. Colleagues, we will have our usual poll now, but I think what the 3S team will do is maybe send a broader questionnaire to colleagues who have attended across all of the modules to see what next steps, if indeed any next steps are needed or wanted by this community. So there will be further follow-up, but your contribution to today's poll is always welcome. As always, please inform colleagues of the recording of these sessions and that they're available for viewing. Patrick, thank you so much for your contribution today. As mentioned a couple of times, this was the final session of our last module, and we appreciate everyone's attendance, not just today, but throughout all of the sessions, and look forward to future engagements with you all. So we'll close there, and thank you again, Patrick, and thank you everyone else for your attendance today and your contributions throughout. Thank you, everyone.